Okay. Good morning. My name is Jill Flessing, and I serve as the chair of the Addiction Counselor Advisory Committee for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask that members of the advisory committee respond to a roll call verbally to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Christina Boyd. Lisa Carter. Jason Hess. Shane Hudson. Chad Jacobs.
Here.
Michael James. Charity Cosson.
Here.
Dulcinea Rakestraw.
Here.
Zenova Williams.
Here.
I note the following BSRB staff members are also present: David Fye,
Here.
Leslie Allen,
Here.
and Sammy Barksdale.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting today being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On August 30th, 2023, we sent notice to the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who requested notice to advisory committee meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I tested that before we started. No individuals are present, but if anyone beeps in, I will let you know.
Okay. This meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda. The first item on the agenda is to approve the agenda. The agenda was provided to you last week by David, and I wonder if there are any additions or corrections to the agenda anyone would like to make. And if not, I wonder if someone would offer a motion to approve the agenda.
This is Dulcinea, and I move to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
I would call a verbal vote by all members present. Those in favor say aye.
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 Anyone opposed, nay? The agenda is approved. The second item on the agenda would be review and approval of the meeting minutes, the previous meeting that was held on August 25th, 2023. If you've had a chance to review the meeting minutes, I wonder if anyone has corrections or additions to the meeting minutes. And if not, would someone move to approve the minutes?
This is Dulcinea again, and I move to approve the minutes as submitted.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
And I would call for a vote by all members present verbally. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Opposed, nays. The minutes from the last meeting have been approved. Next item, Executive Director's Report. David?
Thank you, Jill. So I'm going to go through some of the different items here involving BSRB operations, and then a couple items for the most recent board meeting, and then just some general updates. So we'll start with some operating updates. So we had talked earlier this year about a bill that came before the 2023 legislature, sub for Senate Bill 131. That base for that bill was originally a request from the BSRB on behalf of recommendations made by the board for some changes to statutes. The final version of the bill was combined with a small bill for the Board of Healing Arts and a small bill for the Board of Pharmacy. But the majority of that bill that passed 131 involved the BSRB. And so a lot of items in that bill we've talked about before, but it involved rolling out several new license types, ways to help individuals become licensed more quickly and more easily. And then also ways for individuals who are currently licensed, some flexibilities for them to maintain their licensure, and then some incentives for people who are seeking to become licensed again, who were previously licensed, that make that path easier for them to re-enter the workforce under the BSRB. And so there's also some unique fixes for some different issues involving some of the professions and more standardizations of the statutes and cleanup. So really proud of a lot of the different items in that bill, but the bill implementing those items has been a tremendous amount of work. Behind the scenes, our staff has been working on a number of forms, working with our licensed vendor to make sure that we can actually issue the new licenses. And so at the end of June, we put out a message to all licensees under the BSRB, letting them know about all the upcoming changes. We were able to roll out the majority of items as of July 1st. However, there were a few other items that required a little more work. There were also some items that required some approval of fees to be set. And so we pursued a temporary regulation to set those fees. And we are pursuing a permanent regulation to make sure that those are established permanently as well. But I really wanted to tip my hat to the members of the BSRB staff. They did a lot of work, and those forms are up on the website. We posted, like I said, we sent a message out before July 1st. We sent a second message that's been posted on the BSRB website as of about the middle of August with some of those additional items. But if you are curious about any of those, I would recommend checking out that information that has been posted. We are currently working on some other logistics involved with the passage of that bill based on the new items that we are able to do, and also our new timeframes for licensure. We sought approval from the legislature to hire 2 new licensing specialist positions, and they provided that authority. And so we opened that up to individuals outside of the agency as well as current staff members. And the 2 best candidates for those positions were internal hires. And so we were able to take 2 individuals who wanted to challenge themselves more and take on more responsibility and put them in those new roles, and really happy about that. However, that did mean that opened up 2 additional positions to interview and advertise for. So we went ahead and put those into place. And as of a few weeks ago, we are now fully staffed. And so we are trying to work on helping individuals get more comfortable with their new roles, learn more about some of the processes they'll be working on going forward. And so it's been a big undertaking, and the BSRB, we are not a large agency. And so as of about 3 years ago, we had 9 employees, and now we have 12. And so it may not seem like a lot, but for a small agency, that is, it makes for some big changes. And one of the items we're working through at the moment is getting new technology for staff members, making sure we have good setups. We are physically limited by the amount of space we have in our current building. And this was one of the challenges we talked about earlier this year. So to make it all work, we are exploring having remote work, individuals sharing offices for the days that they're in the office. At the moment, we have temporary setups for a couple of staff members in the boardroom itself. So we're trying to think creatively, use our space effectively until we can get people really into a good position. We also have a number of paper records here in the office, and we are trying to move forward with converting from paper records that were stored here on site to having those stored electronically. And another way we were trying to help out with this process is we had a retention schedule with the state that had our records stored here at the agency for about 10 years and then transferred to an archive with the Historical Society. We were able to shorten that until license expiration plus 2 years instead of license expiration plus 10 years. And so we're in the process of moving those 8 years of records. But coordinating all these things involves several different agencies. And some of those we don't have specific time, control of the time frames, but we're working as quickly as possible, moving things around. At the moment today, there's actually an office next to mine that we're installing some wires and phone cables. So if you hear some bumps, we are literally and figuratively under construction at the moment. But really excited about moving forward on these items, and I think in a few months we'll be in a really good spot. In terms of some other operating updates, we did submit a budget. Every year, state agencies have to provide a budget by the middle of September. So on behalf of the BSRB, I submitted that to the Division of Budget for their review. And essentially, we stuck with the same amounts that we were approved for by last year's legislature for both the current fiscal year 24, and then also the next fiscal year, 2025. The amounts do go up each of those years, but that's primarily because of inflationary costs. As a small agency, we contract with different entities for things like the license hosting service and legal services. And so, but no significant increases above what we were approved for by last year's legislature. In terms of some other updates, I did want to let you know that here at the BSRB office, we have some unique items that are taking place this week. In the past several years ago, we had done roundtable discussions for educators from different schools. This year, we are trying to take a new approach to that. It has been several years since those took place. And given the changes in technology and the expansion of programs across the state, we are going to be hosting an informational forum for educators. And that is taking place tomorrow on Tuesday, October 17th, 2023. It has been a little bit of an undertaking to rebuild our list of contacts from the different programs. Leslie Allen and I do present information to some of the schools throughout the year, mostly to groups of students about licensing and discipline, but we are in the process of trying to rebuild a good contact list for some of those individuals at different programs. And so the purpose of the forum tomorrow is for us to be able to go through some of the changes in statute and regulation recently in the past 3 years. There's been a number of changes that involve licensure, and then also the board we're looking and moving forward on some other changes to regulation. And so we've tried our best to reach out to a number of different schools. I am sure that there are some that we weren't able to reach out to directly this time around, but this is definitely not going to be a one-time thing. I think we will have another of these planned sometime next year. And so for any of the schools we weren't able to catch, we'll try to catch them next time. And if they would like us to do sort of a more personalized type meeting, I'm happy to schedule one of those with those schools. But this should be a good opportunity for us to provide information and allow an opportunity for the members of those schools to ask questions. And then we can provide the board with some of that feedback as well. On Wednesday, October 18th, we are holding a similar informational forum, but this is going to be directed primarily at individuals that are employers of a lot of the licensees that we regulate. And to my knowledge, the BSRB has never had a forum like this specifically for educators, but we think it would be a good idea. There's a number of individuals around the state who are licensed by the BSRB, and we do receive questions from some of the entities that employ those individuals. And so when we decided to go ahead and move forward with a informational forum for educators, we thought separately, let's have a similar meeting for the employers. And so, so that will take place on Wednesday, and really looking forward to speaking with that group of people, going through some of the changes and then being able to answer some of their questions as well. So that'll be coming up this week. And then on Monday of next week, Monday, October 23rd, will be the board's offsite planning meeting. Once a year, the board of the BSRB seeks to have a planning meeting where the board gets together in person and talks about some of the items relevant to the legislative agenda, or some items they've been discussing recently that need more in-depth discussion. And so that meeting will take place at the Seasons venue in Wichita, and information on that has been put out on public notice, and it's also posted on the BSRB website. That meeting is going to take place from 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. It is a public meeting, even though it's not here at the BSRB offices. So any individuals who wish to attend that are welcome to do so. and that information is posted. So looking forward to that meeting on Monday, October 23rd as well. Concerning items from the most recent board meeting, there was a board meeting in September, and at that meeting, the board did welcome the new chair of this advisory committee, Jill Flessing, to the board. Additionally, the board discussed a number of different topics involving supervision, and some of those discussions involved some of the recent discussions by the advisory committee as well. As well as other items from that meeting, the board was made aware of a recent change to federal law. This has to do with service members and their spouses. And there was a change in federal law recently that provides a new pathway for individuals that wish to practice in Kansas. It's an alternative to traditional licensure. We are still working through the details on that with legal counsel for the board, but essentially it appears like it would function more of a registration type system. However, an individual would have to have a valid license, a similar scope of practice in a different state, and they would have to be, like I said, a military service member or a military spouse. And then if they're moving to Kansas, they could notify us once we've done that verification and they provide the information they need to do so, they would be able to practice here in Kansas. However, like I said, we're working through the logistics. For one thing, our current way to inform the public of who's practicing is a license verification portal, and these individuals would not have a license. And so we're trying to figure out how we can make sure we do our job protecting the public by informing people who's practicing in the state of Kansas. And then if there is a complaint against these individuals, our jurisdiction is a little bit unclear. Since they don't hold a license under the BSRB, will we be able to fine these individuals or do a public censure? We can't exactly revoke their license, but there must be some way to limit their ability to practice in the state if there are serious issues. But we're still working through some of those. So those are to be determined. And then another item the board is working on as well, with the passage of Senate Bill 131, there was language in that bill that said that the board would develop an expedited application process. There was no similar model from other states that was used as an example. It was just language added directing the board to develop that process. And so we've had a few conversations with the board trying to figure out a good solution to solve that issue. And I think we're on a good path. And so the board will likely be talking about that with a little bit more detail at the October 23rd board meeting. And so with that, I think I will go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions.
Okay. If there aren't any questions for David, we will move on to the next item of business on the agenda, old business. Continued discussion on proposed changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations from other professions. It is my understanding, and David or Leslie, please correct me, as this discussion started well before I was a part of this, that the board has asked that all the advisory committees review their unprofessional conduct regulations, and with the goal being that a final recommendation be sent back to the board by the end of this calendar year. I waded through this 40-page document yesterday, especially, of course, the addictions counselor conduct regulations, and I had a couple questions on a couple items, but I wonder if folks have comments or thoughts. There's a lot of good, I think, additions or restating of some of the regulations. But I wonder, since I think this conversation began before me, if people had comments or thoughts.
Yeah, and Jill, I'll just interject just to frame this conversation.
Thank you.
You summarized it excellent. This is where we are today. The packet of material you have is about a 40-page document, and any individuals who are following the meeting as well. This is a combined packet. The first 7 pages or 6 pages are the addiction counseling and unprofessional conduct regulations, but the remainder are the unprofessional conduct regulations for each of the other professions. And Jill, as you mentioned, the advisory committee did go through the specific unprofessional conduct regulations for their profession and made recommendations. And those recommendations are demonstrated in the document through the red markups. and other committees did the same thing with theirs, and you can see their proposed changes as well. And then those were all forwarded to the board. The board said they would like the advisory committees to look to see what other advisory committees had recommended, to see if some of those proposed changes might be suitable for your profession as well. And then as part of this, there were one effort was made to combine a couple of different unprofessional conduct regulations. For a lot of professions, they had a separate regulation that dealt with documentation. And so there was an interest in combining those. So those have been combined in most of these professions. And, you know, it's always a little bit tricky because, you know, there is an urge to have consistency between professions, but then for some of the professions that have more of a national association that provides guidance on professional conduct and unprofessional conduct, there's an interest in aligning with what the National Association might say as well. So there's kind of a push and pull, but if you're looking at specific language differences, that could be a reason for some of those. But you do have a lot of discretion here. If you would like to bring over the language that another profession is currently recommending, you're definitely able to do that. If there's any items that do not appear in the addiction counseling regulations that you would like to have added, you could recommend that. Or alternatively, if there's items in the addiction counseling regulations and after these reviews, you believe maybe it should be removed or clarified, that's appropriate as well. So this is kind of the last opportunity for this and potentially the December meeting. But Jill, as you said, yeah, the interest is for the board to have this back by the end of the year, so that way the board can really focus on changes next year.
I would open the floor to any comments.
There was really only one thing I saw on page 3, the top item S. I like that reference to telehealth practice was added, but I don't understand why it says especially. I would prefer it say like including in telehealth practice. I think it's equally important that due diligence be used regardless of setting. It's not more important in telehealth than it is in regular office settings.
I think I would agree with that.
So it sounds like you're recommending changing the word especially to including.
Yes.
Any other thoughts, changes, comments? I had a question that it is not necessarily something to change, but on page 2K, imposing one's personal values, spiritual beliefs, or lifestyle on a client, student, or supervisee. Well, I agree with that. It seemed really unique to the addictions counseling unprofessional conduct regulations, and I just wondered why that was included. Perhaps it should be included. If anyone else had any thoughts, or if that just stuck out to me.
Jill, could you repeat that? Which part were you
Sure.
talking about?
Page 2, under item K, the imposing one's personal values, spiritual beliefs, or lifestyle on a client, student, or supervisee. While that seems reasonable, and I did not see that language in any of the other disciplines, unprofessional conduct documentation regulations, And it just seemed interesting, perhaps, that it was in the addiction counselor's unprofessional conduct language. And it can certainly stay. It just was interesting that it was in this conduct regulations, and I didn't see it in the other disciplines. But it's not necessary to change either.
I like it and might recommend that the other professions add it.
Okay.
Right? Like, I don't know. I like that it's there.
Okay. Cool.
So I had made some notes from when we talked about this a few times ago. And so some notes that were made before, and maybe I've missed something and maybe something has changed since, but I know that there was some discussion about some of the other regulations for the other professions had so a social media provision about informed consent of some sort. And so that was just a thought that maybe we needed something like that. There was also something about the discrimination categories. I'm not sure what the concern was because we do have some listed. And then there was a telehealth provision question. And I don't know that section S covers that or not. But anyway, those were just notes that I had made from before. And I don't know if that might help jog anybody's memory who had some more thoughts about that.
I don't know about the social media. Substance abuse records are just also maintained with other federal confidentiality laws that cover that as well. I don't know to what extent that would need to necessarily be covered. I just like search to find what others have and about like the inappropriate boundaries with clients regarding the use of social media or communicating specifically through social media platforms. And I guess I think that those are probably covered through what we already say, right? Like, I don't know. I'm not sure which one I'm in right now, marriage and family therapy, maybe, that says using a personal profile to connect or communicate with clients on any social media platform. I could see where sometimes that might be appropriate. I don't know, like depending on how that works. So I kind of hate to box us in by having something like that, but I think, that personal communication that's already covered without maybe using the word social media covers it. But thank you for having notes to refresh us.
Yeah, I think the one that was mentioned was the professional counseling. They have something on the very back of theirs on page 7 of their regulation that just says something about disclosing. It's number 57. It says disclosing confidential information through public social media. I think it was more about informed consent than maybe the profile part, but I don't know. I just remember there was some discussion, and maybe it doesn't matter, but just so we don't overlook it if it was important.
I believe it was informed consent, making sure that the clients are educated on, the privacy and everything of social media, and how it might not be that private.
And Jackie, you did mention that there was a social media piece, and also there was a telehealth piece. And it looks like that's on page 36, which is also in the professional counseling proposed changes. I think it's item 58. And so on page 36, item 58 basically says if engaged in distance counseling, failing to fulfill these requirements. And then it talks about informing the client of the risk and benefits of distance counseling, disclosing the possibility of technology failure and providing alternative methods of service, detailing emergency procedures to follow when the counselor is unavailable, and taking appropriate steps to encrypt or ensure security of confidential client information or any activity which protects confidential client information from risk of privacy breach.
Yeah, I see 56 talks more about the consent too. On the page before, I didn't notice that. 56 and 57 and 58 seem to be what you're kind of referring to. Yeah.
It looks like for the social work profession, it looks like they have a similar recommendation too at the end of their regulations on page 42. I think they took those three as well. And I think with marriage and family therapy, professional counseling, and social work, they have pretty similar recommendations on those three items. I think one of the three has slightly different language on the first one of those that talks about accessing the client social media page. The other ones talk more about using the personal profile to connect with and communicate with clients. I think they all include that piece, but one of them talks a little bit about accessing the information too.
Well, it looks like maybe it's flipping through them as hard. That maybe the marriage and family therapy leaves out that, but the other two include the accessing.
Yeah, and I
Oh,
remember,
no, you're right.
yeah, part of the conversation on that, I think, was originally the sort of the working language talked about both communicating with a personal profile and accessing their social media account. But I think there were some conversations of, well, what if someone points out that, you know, your client did this or had this on a public one? You know, there were questions about, is that really something that would be a violation if it's publicly accessible? I think there's some questions around those type issues. So.
I'm fine adding that language similar to what they have in 56, 57, and 58. I just still have some questions about the communicating on any social media platform. Just a lot of times in substance abuse, the clients are very transient and finding ways to communicate with them can be very, very difficult. And sometimes social media may be the only way possible. I would say if something about previous consent was added there, maybe, otherwise that communication that way could be, I find that tricky to create a barrier that says it's unprofessional contact to ever contact somebody via social media when it may be necessary.
I agree, Dulcinea. I think, especially because their phone numbers change so often, when we want to do 6-month follow-ups, 9-month follow-ups, social media is generally the easiest way to get a hold of them. And that's honestly the way they always get a hold of me if they need to come back in.
Well, and I think part of that conversation too was the difference between a personal profile versus a professional profile. Because I know there was some discussion on that too, because they did say, similar to what you're saying, that a lot of people, that's how they communicate is by social media. But they were basically saying, you know, should you have more of a professional page set up versus a personal account, like with Facebook? And is it and maybe this is too much of a distinction, but I think some of their conversation involved around, if you have a personal profile for your own personal use, is that appropriate to be using for communications with clients, or should you have something more structured, like a professional profile or something like that?
I also think it's just, if it is on a personal, just being I have my clients sign releases though for social media, just to make sure that we're covered, so that, you know, they know, hey, if we're going to be communicating through social, you know, I just have them all sign releases for that. But I think that definitely ethically you should be mindful if you have any kind of clients or anything on a personal page that you're keeping it professional and not, I don't know. I just think it's a sticky area.
And I think it potentially gets the BSRB in some weird spots of having to determine what's a professional or personal pay, like, no, I only use this for professional. I don't use it for, personally at all, right? Like, are you going to want to determine that or not? I don't know. For 56, I would say something about, that practicing inappropriate boundaries with regards to social media, including but not limited to, and maybe making sure that the without previous consent includes both communicating and accessing.
I agree with that. I think if there's a middle ground, making like stating language with that there's appropriate signed consent in place. Does anybody feel comfortable making a recommendation on that?
Well, I would recommend that, again, which other professions, things am I in here? Professional counseling, that we add professional counseling, their new numbers 56, with the stipulation that consent is regarding both communication and accessing. I'm not sure exactly how to word that.
I agree.
And I'm also adding their new number 57 about disclosing that information, and new number 58 about telehealth.
Is that anything, David, that would require any sort of vote by the committee?
You could always take a vote, or you could just ask if there's any opposition or other thoughts from members. And then if there's not, you could just find by consensus that that's the recommendation of the committee.
I will do that. Is there any opposition to what Dulcinea suggested about adding 56 with some additional language about consent? 57 and 58 from professional counseling? Okay, no, doesn't appear to be any opposition.
Okay. And then I suppose just to make it clear or clean for the record, we earlier talked about item F under addiction counseling regulations. The item F talked about including, or it said especially in telehealth practice. And it sounded like that there was support for changing the word especially to the word including. So maybe just to make sure we have it good in the minutes that it's consensus that the advisory committee recommended that change as well, unless there's opposition.
Is there any opposition to adding including in place of especially telehealth practice? That appears to be the consensus.
Great. Thank you.
I know that there was language added. Let me see if I can find it. The very last page, page 6. If a practitioner or owner or custodian of client records is to pass away or become incapacitated, that they have some plan for who could access or otherwise deal with their clinical records. I realize that's in one of the other professions regulations. I'm sorry, I can't remember which one. While I realize that this seems like a best practice, I wondered when I was reading this, if someone is deceased or incapacitated, if unprofessional conduct regulations is the place for this?
And that's a good question. We have talked about that a little bit before. I think most of the situations we think about when someone has records that are just out there is when someone passes away unexpectedly. There are other instances where someone abandons records, and then perhaps they might abandon their license and then come back and want to practice again. And so that would be something that we would want to take care of. But honestly, you know, one of the other things we talked about under this topic is just being mindful. And we have asked if we've kind of gone down the road of asking, can we add this as a question on the renewal applications when people apply to renew their license to see if they have something like this in place. And right now, there's really no duty for people to have to do this. And so part of this was to establish that it is a responsibility. And then once it's established as a responsibility, then we could be asking about it. And we think if we bring more light to it, more people will be taking care of this. But I think right now, people in some cases aren't really thinking about this, and then it becomes an issue. But part of this was to put a spotlight on it to make people more aware of this issue so that they could put a plan in place.
There any additional comments, or are folks comfortable with that language being added?
Yeah, from what I recall, we've talked about this a bit, and
Okay.
there just isn't another good place to put it. And that it was really more about it being somewhere so it alerts to people like you have to do this, than necessarily how it would be enforced, but more somewhere that says, hey, this is an important thing to consider when you're having a practice.
That makes sense to me. So looks like there's already a consensus. It was me that had questions just because I was unfamiliar.
No, it's a very interesting topic, and we've looked at a few different angles. This really only comes up for our office a few times a year, but it does come up sometimes where there's a question about what to do with records of someone who has passed away. And for a larger agency like the Board of Healing Arts, they have a specific fund dedicated to, you know, transferring those records over to a different person, and they have more procedures in place to do so. Or there's other entities that become a repository of records, and as a small agency, we actually lack the resources to do that and don't really have the funding to have a separate way to do this. And so we thought this might be a good way to handle this. And the Attorney General's office, they will seize records under certain circumstances, but they really don't have a process set up to transfer the records to another person per se. It's more about trying to make sure the public doesn't get access to confidential information. So we're just hoping if we put a spotlight on this, more practitioners will put something into place, and so it will be cleaner for other people in the future.
Are we good to move on to one other thing that David, you and I talked about, the committee had spoken about? The other thing that I wanted to make sure was noted was page 3X, engaging in physical intimacies with a former client who had been a client at least 24 months in the past. And I know their marriage and family therapy, that is, they removed any date or number of months to ever. The social work code of ethics, it's once you were a client, you were always a client. And I think there's one other that changed 24 months to 60 months. And if there was any additional thought or opposition to the 24 months that's stated in the addictions counselor unprofessional conduct regs. All right. So looks like that one is okay as written. Okay. Were there other comments about other items or items that I didn't note?
I did have a comment about the discrimination item. And so I was looking at them in comparison to the other regulatory boards, or well, the other licenses, I mean, and I was seeing that there were a lot of information that was missing. And so I also think someone else also mentioned that of like potentially that could be some things that we can add. And so I was doing a comparison between, oh, where's my paper? A comparison between marriage and family therapy, licensed psychologists, as well as social workers in terms of like what could potentially be missing from ours and AC. And so things are like ethnicity could be added, disability. Oh, so just to orient everyone, I'm on page 2 of the AC, item L. But for instance, marriage and family therapy on page 20 does add things like ethnicity, disability, health status, relationship status, socioeconomic status, or status in any other marginalized group. The licensed psychologist, they also add things like religion/spirituality, gender identity, immigration status, or language preference. And then social work on page 31 also adds things like political belief. And so those are things that we could potentially add for the AC.
Yeah, and before we open this conversation up too broadly, I can say that this was definitely one of those conversations that was influenced by a lot of the national associations and what terminology some of those associations had recognized. And so, but yeah, you have a lot of flexibility with what items you want to list under regulation like this. And so any language you want to pull over, you can definitely do so. You did mention disability, and it looks like under item L, disability is mentioned at the very end, right before the new language in red. But other than that, I think the other terms that you mentioned, I don't know that I saw here. So.
Nova, is there one of the others that you particularly resonate with that you mentioned, or are there parts of each of them that you would like to pull over?
Mm-hmm. Because I'm an MFT also, I think I resonate the most with MFTs, but there are other things from the LP and the social work that also could be important. The thing that I did have some questions about were like, what does the word directee mean? Like, what is that? How are you defining directee? I don't know what that word means.
Yeah, and maybe Leslie Allen could add a little bit under that context, but basically, I believe that directee was meant to be, we have individuals that are receiving supervision and then other individuals that are under the direction. But Leslie, do you want to comment on that point?
Yes, that is exactly it. They're under direction, and there is in the definition regulation, there's a definition for under direction. So it would be the person that's providing it.
Okay, absolutely. Because I would say the one thing that I find unique about addiction counseling is that they do have people who are peer support or people who are peers. And so would they follow under directees or something else? Because I would say peer support is something that's different from addiction counseling from other licenses. And I would want them to also be protected or included, I guess, in this.
I don't know if they would be under that or not, because this specifies the licensee.
Okay.
Under direction specifies the licensee that's being provided direction.
Gotcha.
So I don't know.
That would be, to me, that would be expanding this to discrimination against like coworker, right? Any employee, right? Like
Gotcha.
to include something like a peer mentor or other, right? You'd have to expand discrimination against any person, period, right? To include those or other, other workplace relationships.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this was the advisory committee that discussed this, but in at least one of them, they looked at the word supervisee, and the question was, does this relate to the supervision relationship based on your license? Or does this also involve things like employment supervision? You know, if you're if you're in the same employment and you are, you know, monitoring the work of that person, you know, does it relate to that type of arrangement, or is it mainly about clinical type supervision? And we talked to legal counsel about that, and they basically said, unless it's specified otherwise, the supervision probably would relate to more of the authority they would have under their license, like the clinical type supervision, versus just a common sense definition of the word supervision in terms of supervisor, like in a work setting.
I would be fine expanding that discriminating to align more closely with the marriage and family therapist and add those additional lines. I think all of that is good.
I agree.
Zanova, I appreciate your comment that you're an MFT. I am a social worker, so I resonate with the social worker language. I wonder if the marital partnership status from the social work page 31, item 12 also could be included.
MFT does have relationship status.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Um,
Okay, that covers it. You're right.
But I think social work does have the difference is political belief, if we wanted to add that. And immigration status, I think.
Language preference, is that? I don't see political belief, but that seems relevant.
There was a discussion previously, I think, on the topic of immigration status, because I think that there are some areas that that becomes sort of a legal issue, where some individuals may be, I think, legally entitled to certain services, and then other individuals may not, or maybe there might be some states or areas that I don't remember the conversation completely, but I remember that being an issue that possibly could put some individuals into a difficult position trying to weigh that. But it's been a little while since that conversation took place, so I honestly don't recall, except that I remember that there being a fair amount of discussion about that item and that it was a little bit more complicated. But unfortunately, I don't remember a lot of that discussion at the moment. So.
I just wonder if what is the definition of discrimination, right? Like, I may not be able to see people who are not here legally because they may not have a payment status in order to pay me for services, right? Like, is that discrimination? Or is that just my business decision that you have to pay me if you want services, right? Like,
Well, I know for licensure, we even have to prove that they're a US and a Kansas resident for our charts. So
well,
I don't.
that's for block grant funding. In
Right.
order, right? In order to be
True.
funded with block grant, they have to be a US
True.
citizen and you have to have
Yeah.
their income. So, I mean, if you had somebody like,
Yeah, I guess for private practice, it might be different. I am not familiar with that area.
so I guess that would be like, is that discrimination if somebody can't provide that information, right? Like, is it discriminating because then they're unable to pay, so you don't provide them services, right? Like, I don't know. Or is that just a business model?
And aren't these, and this, as stated before, isn't this based on the individual licensing? So this is about discriminating against clients individually versus if it's a business model, that's a
Yeah.
different types of discrimination. I mean, we can include immigrant status or not, but I'm just saying in terms of like discrimination, this is at the individual level versus the business
Yeah.
level.
And that makes sense to me that if it's on an individual level, immigration status would seem to be able to be included. But if it's block grant funding, that's kind of the business rules. Anybody feel comfortable making a recommendation about which language or what language you'd like to pull over?
Jill, I thought I'd let you know Mike James has entered the meeting as well, so he's present.
This song. Are
Well, like Leslie, could you make a list of this that is inclusive of what is in hours plus whatever remaining is in marriage and family therapy and whatever is in social work so that it's all encompassing? And have that be hours?
So I think Scammy will be doing the minutes for this one.
Oh,
but
okay, sorry.
we could mark it up and then bring it back to the December meeting. But it sounds like that there is at least interest in taking the items that are here in item L and then adding any items that are found in a marriage and family therapy unprofessional conduct regulation on this point. And then is it also fair to say any of the remaining items for the social work item? And then bring that back so you can kind of see the list of all three of those essentially put together as one.
Is there any opposition to doing that and bringing it back to the December meeting? Okay. And that seems the consensus. Okay. Before we move on to the next item on the agenda, are there other comments, questions about changes to unprofessional conduct regulations? Okay. David, are we good to move to the next item?
Yep.
Okay.
Appreciate the conversation on this topic.
Yeah. The next item of old business is continued discussion of possible changes to clinical training plan requirements. I have some notes. This, if I am correct, was about informing the board within 45 days of major changes to a clinical training plan.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. And if the 45 days is too strict and makes people lose hours of clinical supervision, or if there is some other way to indicate what is a significant change. And if the 45 days is too strict or not strict enough, and I would open the floor to conversation about that.
Okay. And just to frame this too, I'm going to share my screen here. So we're talking about a regulation here. It is KAR 102-7-6. And that's professional postgraduate supervised experience required for a clinical addiction counselor. And what Jill was just discussing is item J. And that has to do with the requirement, as she mentioned, we require individuals seeking clinical licensure to submit a training plan in advance of accruing hours, and that has to be reviewed and approved. And then there is an item here in J that talks about any changes have to be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the change took effect. And then the current information in this regulation says if the supervisee fails to submit the change to the board within 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And there has been some discussion by the board and the advisory committees about, what is the goal that is trying to be accomplished here. And I think the goal is to make sure that people are accruing hours that would be in alignment with what the regulations would require. And the 45-day requirement here, I believe, was to try to motivate people to send those changes to the board as soon as possible. So that way, if there was something that they were doing that was not in alignment with the regulations, the board could review that and say, yes, we reviewed this and approved it. You are still doing hours that would meet the definition. And so, but there were some pretty strong teeth to this 45-day rule, because the language here says that if you fail to submit those changes within 45 days, any hours accrued after that point would not be counted. And so what happens in a handful of cases is someone completes all of their hours and realizes that they did not turn in a change. And then the board really has no choice but to say, was this actually a change? And if it was, the board has to deny those hours, which means that the person would have to go back and, complete a change and then accrue the hours again that they weren't able to count. But, I think the board and the advisory committees have discussed some flexibilities here on this topic. One would be, providing the board more opportunity to review these types of cases at the end, rather than having strict language that the hours would have to all be denied. Another thing that we have talked about is whether it should be all substantial changes versus all changes that would need to be reported. And while this does give some flexibility to the individuals accruing hours, it also could create some questions and confusion on people knowing what would be a substantial change and what they would have to turn in and what they wouldn't. So we've talked about this a few times, and we've also talked about it from the licensing board perspective. How can we give clear guidance to people when they ask this question? And so basically, what we have been wrestling with recently, and Leslie could probably speak to this a little bit more too, one of the other advisory committees asked the question, what if we said, all changes need to be submitted to the BSRB, and we removed the requirement about 45 days. And so we also could add some language in here that any kind of work after making a change would have to be in alignment with what the regulations would allow. That way, if individuals did make a change, they would need to report it to the BSRB. But if they failed to do that when they submitted their hours at the end, we would be able to review them. And if they were in alignment, we wouldn't have to just automatically reject them for not meeting this 45-day rule. It might mean some people would have a little bit of a lag at the end of the process, because we would have to be reviewing those at the end versus, when those people made the change if they didn't submit it. But we would no longer be rejecting the hours purely by them not meeting this 45-day rule. And we talked about, could we send out messages to people who were accruing hours on a periodic basis, reminding them that if they made a change, they should report that to the BSRB. They would be getting some reminders about doing that. But under this or under the alternate proposal, if the hours weren't in alignment, they wouldn't be counted either way. So right now, I think maybe the issue is, can we remove this 45-day requirement? And so that would allow us to be able to approve hours that would have been in alignment. So that's currently what we're wrestling with. And Leslie, do you have any other, did I cover that pretty well in terms of the recent conversation?
Yeah, well, there was one suggestion to leave the 45 days, but take out that any of the hours would be not counted. To kind of give them, it gives us the opportunity, even if they submit it late, Joan could review it and approve it rather than having to take it to the board every time. If it would meet, And that really generally is the case. I would say 9 times out of 10, the changes that someone makes, if they had submitted them in time, they would have counted. So the ability to allow them to keep those hours and not have to take every single amendment to the board would be ideal, I think.
I like that if you all think that that is workable within your processes. Like, I personally like having a date, just it's helpful to say, oh, that needs to be done within 45 days, right? Like, instead of, oh, I did that, 3 or 4 months ago and forgot to send that, right? It at least gives some kind of time frame. But if there is a way to word it to allow, instead of no supervised hours, or only hours that align with statute or regulation will be counted, or something like that, in order to allow that, I like that kind of middle ground.
I agree. I think it also speaks to a little bit of professionalism. We know that we have guidelines and rules, but there's still some flexibility.
I'm going to agree with that. I think giving the board flexibility and the staff flexibility to deal with it, but leaving that 45-day there does push, that way when you do have to not approve it, you've got the time frame as well as whatever was not appropriate. So as long as it fits within the process, because that was going to be my question, is like, okay, so how often do you guys encounter this? We don't want to add additional things if it's not necessary to the tasks you have to complete. So
It happens.
I am sure that it
Yeah.
happens, given knowing my own function with time days and things stuff. I can imagine it happening.
Right.
And yes, it hasn't changed, Jill. So
And
Okay,
it wouldn't
that
be-
was obvious.
Yeah. It would be, and the problem now is that it has to be approved by the board. So if the board feels the change didn't necessarily have to be submitted, they can track with why the person didn't submit it. But then you have to tell the applicant or the licensee that's accruing hours, well, maybe they'll count, maybe they won't, but you'll have to wait until the end and you apply for the board to make that determination. So this would give Joan or I guess Tyler now, the opportunity to review the changes and approve them at the time rather than waiting until the application goes before the full board.
Yeah, I do like the flexibility, because I've been in a situation before where I moved out of state, but I still wanted to be licensed in Kansas. And so wanting to be able to collect hours from another state, but not knowing if that would count towards it until afterwards. And so it was like, well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. And then also like the 45 days, like when you're moving out of state, like trying to get everything settled and things like that. But I also came back to Kansas. So that's what was happening. That was during my PhD. So that can happen. I can see that people doing internships or practicums or something like that. And so I think having the flexibility would be really beneficial for people, at least being able to say yes or no when we submit those hours or that training plan or something.
So just to summarize, are we suggesting that the 45 days stay in place, but the no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued after that be taken out?
We're saying to, not that no hours would be approved, but instead that hours would only be approved as they, align with, I don't know if it's statute or regulation or whatever the correct word is, right? And then Leslie also said something about the approved by the board piece too, right? That also needs to be adjusted, because it may be able to be approved directly by staff. and not by the whole board.
Yeah, it needs to be approved by staff or the board, but the board can also delegate that to Joan.
Okay,
So submitted by the supervisee to the board or board representative, board staff member. We need to be more clear about that.
I think the suggestion was just take out if the supervision fails to submit for the rest of that paragraph.
Yeah, what we usually do is there's a lot of references to the board and statutes and regulations, and we usually just leave it as the board. And then frequently what we'll do is he'll have a delegation motion. The board will just take up at a certain point on record. So that way we know when it references board here, it means BSRB staff or executive director, or sometimes it actually doesn't mean the board.
so just in this one, just have those first two sentences.
Mhm.
So they have to be submitted to the board. And they shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date they took effect.
Mhm.
And then the rest deleted.
Yeah,
Then does there need to be language added about if what happened, I'm sorry, I'm belaboring the point. If the hours somehow do not align with the training plan, that they wouldn't be counted, or is that just, again, belaboring the point?
when I look at it, I think if you're sending them for approval, so they're either gonna be approved or denied. So I don't think so, but we could ask legal what they think about it, if that needs to be put in or not.
Yeah,
So,
we would definitely want it to be the understanding that if someone did hours that were in alignment with the regulations, we could count those.
Right.
It would be the hours that weren't in alignment with the regulations that would not be counted. So
okay. At this point, are we comfortable with keeping the first two sentences and striking the rest of the language? Is there any opposition to doing that? Okay. That appears to be the consensus.
Okay.
Okay. The next item on the agenda is continued review and discussion of possible changes to regulations. Continuing education for licenses. According to, unless I'm reading this wrong, the minutes, the last meeting, we agreed to remove self-directed projects. And we discussed post-tests and remove the post-test requirement for certain hours. David, am I missing something about what this agenda item is?
no, you have it correct. And I would ask for if there is support for this from the advisory committee. It looks like the references to those regulations in the minutes is incorrect. It
Oh.
should be 102-7-9, and the following one is 102-7-10. So I'll make sure that is corrected.
Okay,
But you are correct. In the last meeting, there was a discussion on those regulations, and there were those recommendations that you added. And then what we said is we could bring these back if there were some additional comments or thoughts in between that meeting and this meeting. And if there were any further recommendations, we could talk about them at this meeting.
okay. I'd open the floor to any continuing thoughts about removing the language allowing for self-directed learning projects, because I think Leslie said this doesn't happen, maybe ever. And removing the requirement for post-tests for certain continuing education hours. Is there any further discussion or recommendation? Is there any opposition to making this recommendation? Okay, and that is the consensus of the committee. Okay, the next item for discussion is number 2, documentation for continuing education, or is that the post-test and
So yeah, the next one has to do with the 102-7-10, and it's sort of a companion regulation to the continuing education regulation, but it just specifies the manner of providing documentation to demonstrate that someone has completed those hours. And so at the last meeting, we talked a little bit about, well, we were going to talk about this one, but time was short. And so we said if individuals had recommendations on changes, we could talk about them at this meeting.
So I think we'd want to take out the self-directed project on this one too, right? And then in looking at it, my only question was about several places it says a copy shall not be accepted. So I was
wondered about that
wondering
too.
what exactly that means, because I don't think I've ever sent anything original besides my application to the BSRB.
So when people are audited, they're supposed to send in the actual CEU certificates. And a long time ago, that copies mattered because you got originally signed things. Now things are computer generated and you do a lot online and you print out your own certificate. So it's really not as important now. And that's one of the things that I think we were going to bring up to consider removing, because especially since the pandemic, we started allowing people to email their documents rather than mailing them. And that really does work better. The mail still is not really great. So
well, it makes sense to me to remove that from the several places that it is mentioned.
Sorry, I was trying to pull up the attachment.
Yeah, and I can share my screen on that one if that would be helpful.
That would be helpful to me. Thank you.
Sure.
and then Dave and D as in dog is where you were taking out videotape and just putting video or audio recording, right?
Yeah, so there is some language here that is a little bit outdated that makes references to videotapes and audio tapes. And so unless there is any opposition, we would be interested in changing some of that terminology so that videotapes could be replaced by video recordings and audio tapes by audio recordings. And here's a copy of the regulation. It's 102-7-10. And so some of the examples of where it says a copy shall not be accepted are down in F, as well as in C, and it's like in B, that language is included as well. But if you're interested in doing so, we could
There's one at J as well.
strike that.
Oh, way bit down by the history.
So we could strike any references that say a copy shall not be accepted.
Is there any opposition to removing the language about a copy shall not be accepted? So that seems to be the consensus, to strike the language about a copy will not be accepted. Otherwise, you mentioned videotape, audio tape. Tell me again, what was the proposed language to update?
Yeah, and this would be it's sort of in reference to both 102-7-9 and also 102-7-10. But it would be updating those references. So instead of saying videotapes and audio tapes, it would say video recording and audio recording. That way, if they are still using videotapes and audio tapes, it would still count. But if it is something where it's more available on a computer and video or audio form, that would probably be better going forward.
Is there any opposition to changing that language from anyone on the committee? No. Okay, then that seems to be the consensus on that language as well. Was that all the items on documentation for continuing education?
I believe so, unless anybody had any other proposed changes to this regulation. It looks like it has not been updated in, well, since about 2012. So it's definitely due for some updating.
I have one thing, Dave, the other committees have been considering whether receiving supervision would be appropriate for continuing education.
And so this is for 102-7-9.
Yes.
That's something that could be talked about under these two regulations.
So the under and in the CEU regulation, you can get CEUs for providing supervision to practicum or intern students, or for applicants for the LCAC. So if you're providing their supervision, you can have some CEUs, and some of the professions are considering whether or not to allow the people receiving the supervision, can they also get CEUs for that?
Could it be something with the same, like, maximum allowable number of hours?
Yes,
Because you wouldn't want all of the CEUs
right,
to be supervision, right?
right. And I've heard both positive and negative remarks about it, so it's really up to you. It's just something that's come up.
Do you, Leslie, do you recall how many hours that they would count for that?
It was either 8 or 10.
I think I'd want, if we include that, I think I'd want some kind of maximum number they could count towards that. It just seems like supervision's appearance, since it's not kind of controlled by approved supervisors, although you know, that kind of trained supervisors, seems like we're opening that up to, would they be getting the continuing education we hope for, to allow them to get, because they could get almost all their hours that way if we didn't put a boundary on it. So yeah, I think there should be at least a boundary on it, number of hours.
I think I agree with that, and I think I would support the lower number, because depending on your practice setting, what you are discussing in supervision may or may not be of a continuing education nature,
Could be all administrative.
right?
So
So
there's a role for that for supervision and education, but that's pretty agency specific. So
I think that it would be for people who are receiving supervision for the LCAC, not just work supervision.
Right.
Okay, I was just making sure.
Anyone?
So I don't, Leslie, David, one of you guys, could you kind of summarize the piece of what we've kind of, what we're working to move and change right here on this one? For some reason, my brain is like not tracking great this morning.
It would be for LMACs who are receiving clinical supervision to count some of those hours toward their continuing education requirement. And for supervision, you get a maximum of 10 hours. So it could be the same or it could be less.
So something on the 102-7-9, it's number 8 says providing supervision to practicum or intern students, applicants for licensure, blah, 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 the maximum. So receiving supervision as an applicant for licensure as a clinical addiction counselor or something like that, or as a potential applicant
Receiving clinical supervision,
or under an approved plan.
yeah, something like that. I was gonna look, hold on 1 second. Let me look at,
I see some language here under the psychology regulation. What it specifies there, it says receiving supervision as defined in definition regulation, except in connection with any disciplinary action, for which a maximum of 15 continuing education hours shall be allowed. Now, the psychologists have to get 50 hours every 2 years, so it's a little bit different, but
and if you guys don't like it, you don't have to add.
No, I was just struggling with wording right now, Leslie. I'm like, okay, I need to make a motion to move it forward, but I don't have the words to make it clear of what we want to change. How about that?
Well, you don't have to do the specific language. You could just make a motion to add someone under a clinical training plan receiving supervision can count 10 hours toward their CEUs or something like that.
Sounds great, Leslie. I will move that.
Okay.
I'll second.
Okay, is that one we can do by consensus, David?
yes. Mhm.
Okay, is there any opposition to Mike and I believe Zenova's motion to move 10 hours of CEU credit if you're receiving supervision?
With a
With clinic-
maximum of 10
Maximum of
10.
hours.
And I didn't motion for it. I didn't.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed
That was
somebody.
Charity.
I'm sorry, Charity. The Charity.
So it's
Also,
fun to watch to see which mouth moves, right?
And how about if we do a little carve out, if there's no opposition to this, a little carve out like the psychology one has, where it says, except in connection with any disciplinary action. That way we'll make it very clear.
Absolutely. Yeah.
absolutely. Okay. Any opposition from committee members to that little carve out caveat?
No.
Okay. It looks like there's consensus. Okay, next, I realize that we have about a half hour left. And it's my understanding that number 4 on old business is a relatively new discussion. Discussion of alternate licensure reciprocity process based on years of service in lieu of meeting other requirements. This is one that I think was put on the agenda before I was involved. So if anybody could give me some summary thoughts or background on this, I would appreciate it a great deal.
And I would appreciate someone else helping to frame this conversation as well, because I think some of this goes back to before my time working for the board. But I do know that when it comes to some of the professions, the requirements for licensure are pretty standardized state to state. For example, social work, they have a national accrediting body, CSWE. And basically, there might be some small differences between unprofessional conduct and CEs and things like that, but requirements for licensure are pretty standardized. In terms of the addiction counseling profession, the terminology for what addiction counselors are called in states differs. The requirements for licensure differs. I believe that there's different types of examinations that are accepted in different states. There was a conversation recently this year to, we had a national accrediting body present, but it is one that is growing. And so I think some of this conversation originated from individuals who may be practicing these types of services for many years in a different state, who may not, their qualifications may not align with what Kansas would accept for an addiction counseling license. And I think some individuals wanted the opportunity to discuss if it was appropriate to look at alternative requirements for individuals who have been practicing for a number of years, who may not have undertaken the same requirements for licensure that we have here in Kansas. But like I said, I would appreciate other people adding to framing this conversation too, because I think a lot of this conversation goes back before my years working for the board.
I think specifically it's the bachelor's degree. In some
Yeah.
states, they aren't required to have a bachelor's degree, or their education that they have to get is not from a university, it's a training.
Yeah.
I think Deb brought it up, and I think it was about the degree and
That's the way I remember it, Leslie. I think it is the degree issue. Kansas, my experience in helping students that are kind of coming from multiple different places is Kansas has I think the highest educational requirement for a substance abuse counselor. I couldn't say of all states, but absolutely the ones that I've encountered. So the alternative path, if my understanding is correct, and Dulcinea, Jacqueline, you guys can help me if you remember more of this conversation, is there a path? Do we want to create a pathway for those that say we're working in Missouri? They have the CRADAC credential, I think, over there, which is their highest level credential for a substance abuse counselor, because they don't license, they just credential, but they do not have specific university type credits for education background. They've done it through more of that technical training kind of idea, apprenticeship idea for training, because any of the states who use the ICRC model of credentialing use kind of the way that Kansas used to do it, which was train them up through experience, CADC 1, CADC 2, that kind of thing of what we used to do in Kansas. And education could be used as in lieu of the training, but Kansas doesn't have a way of using experience in lieu of education. So was it last week? I talked to a woman that worked in Colorado. She's been a counselor out there doing independent stuff for 20 years. And I told her she has to come back and get a bachelor's degree if she wants to work here. And that was pretty much, okay, we lost a counselor. I can guarantee we lost a potential counselor, because she's not going to do, another 2 years of education to become what she's been doing for 20 years. So I think the conversation was, do we want to find a way for experience to be a part of, or an alternative pathway to that credential for those that may not hold the bachelor's degree? And if we do that, could we go ahead, Dulce?
No, I mean, that's what I was gonna say. That's what I recall too. And this is just that tricky subject because it's what we require if you're from Kansas, right? So if you're a Kansas student, you have to get a bachelor's degree, right? But instead I go to Missouri and then I don't have to get that. And then I can just practice there, a couple years and then come back with lower. That's where it always feels kind of sticky to me, is what would be the appropriate length of time.
Let's do the other, I know, and we're not looking at apples here because there's no other bachelor's level credentials other than what the behavioral analysis and social work potentially, and most
they
states
both
don't
have to
bother
have
with the social work.
degrees. Yeah,
Yeah.
the bachelor's, they must have at least a bachelor's degree. They don't waive that.
So in that reciprocity for the other licenses, and I know we're not talking about the same thing because of the degree differences, but experience wise, how many years are they requiring for that to be You know, so I know like with LPC, you can transfer over from state to state, generally speaking, but you have to have X number of experience or be licensed X number of years with the other jurisdiction.
So for the bachelor's, for the master's levels, it's different for the
Mhm.
clinical. But for the bachelor's level now, you just have to be licensed for 1 year.
1 year.
And have the degree and the exam. Or, sorry, the degree. You still have to have the degree.
Mm.
This was also a really big deal when we were moving to licensure, that the other professions were strongly opposed to addiction counselors becoming another licensed profession unless a minimum of a bachelor's degree was required. And so in order to move through the legislative process, the minimum of the bachelor's degree had to be there. Because prior to licensure, when we were credentialing, they had moved to an associate's. It wasn't necessarily an associate's degree, but it was that number of credit hours, I think, right? Like, I don't know that you had to have a degree, you just had to have a certain number of credit hours. But it was around that. So I don't know, like now that we are licensed, they can't kick us out, right? So can we change it? I think, you know, there's significant workforce issues in the state. Addiction counselors, particularly at the LIC level, are very difficult to find. People aren't being licensed by that standalone. We're getting a few that come through social work already, right? Like that come through other professions or other degree programs. And there is definitely a need for more of them. How many, you know, would be interested in coming over from other states is a different, you know, is a different thing. And again, that, are we going to have more stringent requirements for people from Kansas who intend to stay in Kansas and practice in Kansas than we would have for people that are in another state that want to come here?
I do think when they discussed it previously, it was like a good length of time, not just like 2 years, but maybe 10 years or, you know, something like that. It couldn't do it quickly.
Yeah,
Couldn't circumvent education quickly.
yeah, I don't remember the timeframes that we had talked about because I vaguely remember that conversation, but I know it wasn't 2 or 3 years. It was a lengthy, you know, they clearly had been demonstrated that they were solid in the profession, at least from that's what you can do from experience. Do you have a sense, Leslie? Do you get a lot of applications that's the issue, or because I'm sure they apply anyway, even with their experience, even if they don't have the degree, they do it anyway.
I actually don't. I don't get a lot of addiction counselor reciprocity applications. There's some, but most of them have had the degree. But people do call and ask.
Right. That's probably we can't get a good call hard on that number. And I can say that it is relatively frequent in my conversations, and I know sitting right here in Kansas City, I know I get more than you would in anywhere else probably. And I have a handful of students that jump across the state line and work for a couple of years while they finish their degree and then come back.
Right. So at Washburn, we do have the bachelor's in addictions counseling as well as the master's in addictions counseling. So we do see students from other places, especially like Missouri, as you were saying. Texas also has something that's like credentialed at like the bachelor's level, and just other in Colorado, things like that, is places that are kind of near us and around us. And so, but of course, they're coming back to us to get that degree so that they can get licensed. And so I'm not necessarily opposed to, or I guess I'm in support of, or I guess, yeah, I'm not opposed to, I guess is a better way to say it, of a person who has no less than, I would say, 5 years, because if a bachelor takes about 4 years, and then you want that experience, no less than like 5 years of experience in the field, if they're already credentialed or licensed in another state to be able to come over, versus just, I guess, if they're just practicing for 5 years without a license, or I don't know what other states do, or how they do those things, and they don't have a degree. So yeah, I guess that's my 2 cents on it.
I agree with you. I think if they're credentialed or have a certificate or whatever other states do, and I think 5 years is a good amount of experience. I mean, I am feeling the lack of licensed addictions counselors in Kansas, so I want to say, yes, let's just get somebody in here, but at the same time, there does have to be a level of professionalism and a level of ethics and boundaries that experience is how they get that.
So to throw a piece into this, and I think it sounds like I might be one of the ones that has more knowledge of some of the other states' credentialing process, but so the ICRC process is the CADC process, and there's 3 levels there that different states can do. But the states can do their own kind of, for example, Missouri has 2 training level credentials, and then the CADC, which is the 3rd level. Okay. And they can't stay at the 1st level indefinitely. They have a time frame. I don't remember what it is, but the 2nd level of just a counselor doing stuff, they can stay the MADAC 2 forever. They do not have to progress to the next level. My gut as an educator and that kind of stuff tells me I'd want at least the CADC level. Those ones that are just kind of sitting and not finishing that additional little piece of whatever their training is, and I'd have to look at the ladder to look at it. I think I'd want that credential that has the international, because it comes down to it's a NADAC credential or a ICRC credential. Those are the 2 versions that the states tend to have over other or licensure. But I think that's my personal opinion. I don't think I'd want those ones that are sitting at the training level, kind of apprentice level forever, be moving over without that next step. Maybe that means we have to require the exam. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to Google it up and see what I could find, and the like professional career ladder that I found was from 2016. So I think there probably been some
Which
changes.
Missouri's
It's-
or
Well, no, it's a SAMHSA,
oh, Samson's. Okay.
and it has the NCAC 1 as the National Certified Addiction Counselor level 1 that goes up to an associate's degree, then level 2 bachelor's degree, and then master's addiction counselor above that. But yeah, I mean, I think, but I don't know how you write in other certifications that we don't recognize.
And yeah, that was my issue too, because the different ones certify, like you can get a separate certification in medication assisted treatment, and it's not attached to any of the other ones. You know what I mean? So it's like we'd have to be very specific. We'd have to be clear enough that this is the kind of credential we're looking for.
And what if I'm from Kansas and I qualify for that credential, right? Like, would we like grandfather somebody in? I don't know.
I don't know. It's sticky.
Well, if you qualified for the credential, but you didn't have the years of experience.
Yeah. I support something. I don't know what it is yet.
Well, and this does not have to be something that we totally resolve today. Sounds like it might be a good conversation to keep having with the committee, maybe.
I wondered if this was something we want to bring back to the December meeting to continue discussion.
I think that's a good idea.
Probably. Is there any questions that maybe we need to try to research on or figure something out to bring back to it? I mean, obviously a couple players who aren't here might have some additional thoughts that could move the discussion, but I'm not sure what that would be. That's my problem.
I'm
Because I
trying to look up
guess-
ICNRC and I can't even get to their website.
Well, because that's what Missouri does.
Internationalcredentials.org.
And Missouri is an ICNRC
They
state,
are.
right?
Yeah, Missouri is, Colorado is, California has both. They have licensure and the credentialing. They do both. Texas is an ICRC as well,
I just
but it
remember
looks a little different.
lots of icky feelings from around the time addiction counselors became a license around all of this.
Yeah.
Because my only thought was, would it be, and we would have to be really specific about like licensing, credentialing through state, but also like which certificates or which credentials would count. Because there are also like rehabilitation credentialing. Is that going to, you know, count towards ours or not? Because I think Missouri also has things like that. So yeah, I would have to like look at that. I'd probably also look at maybe NADAC and what their credentialings are for addictions counselors. And should we require an exam? If they do, or if they come over, that could be a way to regulate it. Not sure.
This may be a silly question. Is there a standardized exam that exists? Because long ago, I took an exam, but that was when we were credentialed, not licensed.
There are two.
There are two, okay.
NADAC has one and ICRC has one. History wise, I know those two agencies are friendlier than they have ever been. I don't know how close they're coming to kind of starting to overlap more. I think that gets pretty sticky because the ICRC doesn't, it includes other national jurisdictions, Canada, Europe, South America, that kind of stuff. So I think it gets hard for them to adopt stuff, but I know, the tests don't overlap completely, let's put it that way. And they do have, I think both of them have I think ICRC has 2-level exams and NADAC has 3. And we use the second level, correct, Leslie?
Yes, we use the NCAC 2, and we do allow the ADC exam from ICNRC as well.
You do,
Mhm.
okay.
If someone's already taken it, we'll accept it.
Okay, so okay.
With the education,
Yes.
right? Because that,
yes.
because you could be ICNRC without the education.
Correct.
Yes.
So is this an item that people feel comfortable tabling at this time and bringing back to the December meeting? Is there any opposition to that?
No.
Okay,
I'd move to table it and maybe try to do a little bit of exploring to see if there's, because I had not thought, Dr. Williams, I had not thought about the credential for like rehabilitation counseling and that kind of thing coming in. Because I see that so rarely, but yeah. Yeah, I would say table it and for further discussion.
if
Also, it took us like 5 years, right? 10 years to get the license, so hey.
there's no opposition to tabling it, can we table it until the next meeting, please? All right, new business. David, I might ask for a little bit of guidance here regarding future topics for advisory committee meetings and setting a future time and date for the meeting in December, and then discussing if we want to, how we want to schedule meetings in 2024. We want to still do advisory committee meetings every other month, or if some other schedule like quarterly would be more workable for folks. I would ask for thoughts.
Regarding the time and date, we have been quarterly, right?
We were quarterly for about a year and a half maybe, but I think we switched to every other month back earlier this spring. And so we've been doing it about every other month for the last probably 3 meetings or so.
It was specifically trying to accomplish one of the tasks that I think we got through, right, David? I don't,
I thought it was about that, the possible.
the
like,
student license, I think,
licensure
yeah, I
student
think
thing
that's
that
what
we
it
were wanting
was.
to work through that, so we were meeting more regularly.
Yeah, the new student temporary license, I think a lot of the extra meetings involved that. But since that time, I think at least since earlier this year, they've been every other month type meeting. So could go back to quarterly, or we could stay every other month.
Does anyone have a specific preference?
Monday mornings is a rough time. I think we filled out some kind of survey or something maybe to set this time. I don't recall.
And that was because of me, because I couldn't do later in the week this week.
So I just would say in general, Monday mornings is a rough time to schedule a meeting. I'd prefer a different time of the week, but otherwise I'm open.
Second that.
After about 11 o'clock is more useful for me.
Chad, I think you said something, but we couldn't hear you.
No, I'm open to about any time after 11.
Okay. So later in the week after 11, any thoughts on every other month or quarterly?
I think unless there is a specific thing that we need to talk about, I mean, quarterly is fine, but if there's something happening that needs to be discussed more often, then I'm open to every other month.
David and Leslie, do we need to have a December meeting to make end of year recommendations to the board?
I don't think so. There may be items that come up at the board's out of town planning meeting or the November board meeting, but right now it's kind of too early to tell. There were still a few items that they were going to be revisited for the board to discuss concerning some of the changes to regulations. So I think it may be helpful to have that December meeting and then start quarterly meetings in 2024.
Okay. Is there any opposition to holding a December meeting and then moving to quarterly meetings starting in 2024? Okay, so that seems the consensus. Do we, in the interest of time, do we need to set a date and a time for that December meeting now?
If you have one in mind, we can put it on the calendar. If not, I can always send out a poll and then see when individuals are available in December too. So
I would like to have a poll because I don't have like my clinical schedule up in front of me. Would anyone else oppose that?
It works for me because depending on when in December, the morning thing may
I
not be
know.
as much of an issue for me because I might be past the end of the school year stuff. So
okay. Well, I'll send out a list of available times in December. We can find a date for that. And then we can start looking at date and times for meetings. In general, it sounds like after 11 o'clock is probably a good solution. Is there a certain day of the week that would work better for members in terms of a recurring meeting?
Not Monday. If what I'm hearing everybody say, sorry, that was me. Okay. Regarding future topics, would you like to, is there some way to send out an email requesting if there are future topics as we're almost out of time?
You know, that's just open.
Okay.
We can just address that the next meeting in December, just to kind of, we've kind of wrapped up most of the items we were going to be focusing on this year. And so we can kind of start with some new topics next year.
Okay, so David will send out a poll about the December meeting, then we'll move to quarterly meetings in 2024. I believe that is it for today. I thank you all for being here and for your time. I know it's very valuable. I wonder if I could get a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
I'd ask for a verbal vote to adjourn the meeting. Everyone in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone
Aye.
opposed? All right, thank you all very, very much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.